Some people do not become bitter all at once. It happens quietly. A disappointment you never fully recovered from. A humiliation you still replay in the shower 10 years later. Trust collapsing at exactly the wrong moment. And then one day you notice something frightening. Your first instinct is no longer hope. It is defense. You enter rooms already preparing for disappointment. You stop calling it pain. You call it realism. There are people who can laugh at dinner and still feel something cold sitting underneath the conversation. People who answer messages, go to work, make coffee, pay bills, smile in photographs, while some old injury keeps speaking beneath everything they do. Not loudly, just constantly. A sentence someone said years ago that still burns without warning. A betrayal that keeps changing shape in memory. A grief that no longer arrives as tears, but as exhaustion, as distance, as the feeling that your own life has started happening slightly too far away from you. And sometimes the worst part is not the suffering itself. It is catching yourself becoming someone you would not have recognized before it happened. More suspicious, more guarded, less patient with joy. Because suffering does not only wound people, it rearranges them. You can see it if you pay attention. Two people survive the same kind of heartbreak. One becomes softer. The other sharpens into something difficult to reach. One learns mercy. The other begins distrusting every kind voice before it even finishes the sentence. And the terrible thing is that bitterness usually begins as protection. Nobody wakes up wanting to harden. It happens by accumulation. A disappointment here, a humiliation there. Days where someone had to continue answering emails while something inside them was quietly collapsing. Small abandonments repeated enough times that eventually the body starts preparing for loss before loss even arrives. After a while, they no longer react to life. They brace for it. That is a different way to live. You can feel it immediately when someone walks into a room already expecting injury from people who have not even spoken yet. And maybe that is what bitterness really is. Pain that stopped believing tomorrow could be different from yesterday. A bitter person is often someone who got tired of being emotionally ambushed. So they closed the gates early, locked everything before nightfall. And yet, there are others. People who suffered just as deeply and somehow became larger instead of smaller. Not happier, not untouched, larger, as if suffering hollowed them out without emptying them. You sit near them and feel it immediately. A calm that does not need to announce itself. A gentleness with scar tissue beneath it. They do not speak about pain theatrically. They speak the way people speak after surviving something they can no longer simplify. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What stands in the way becomes the way." And people hear strength in that sentence, discipline, endurance. But underneath it there is something more frightening, transformation. The possibility that suffering is not only revealing your pain, it is revealing your character. Not because pain is holy, it is not. Anyone who speaks too beautifully about suffering has probably never watched it ruin somebody slowly. There is nothing poetic about panic at 3 a.m. Nothing noble about watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, while the world continues behaving as if nothing happened. Pain is real, but so is what pain uncovers. Hard years do not build a person from scratch. They reveal what comfort was covering. There are parts of ourselves we only meet when life stops cooperating, when control fails, when distraction fails, when the future you secretly depended on collapses in a single afternoon. Then suddenly you are left alone with the voice you spent years drowning out. That is where the split begins. Not in suffering itself, in what suffering convinces you of. One person says, "Life hurt me, therefore life is cruel." Another says, "Life hurt me, therefore now I understand something about other people." The pain may be equal, the meaning is not. Bitterness begins when suffering starts looking like proof that nobody stays, proof that softness is weakness, proof that hope is for naive people who have not yet been cornered by reality. And after certain losses, hope does feel ridiculous, like laughing too loudly in a hospital. There is a reason wounded people sometimes mock tenderness. Tenderness reminds them of the version of themselves that trusted before they understood the cost. But there is another kind of softness that only appears after suffering. Not innocence, decision. A person who remains gentle after life gave them every reason not to becomes almost dangerous in a different way, because now their kindness is conscious. Now it has survived contact with reality. That kind of person does not forgive because they are weak. They forgive because hatred began eating the walls of their inner life. They understand how easily pain spreads from one person into another, how suffering, left unattended, reproduces itself through tone, through silence, through the way someone shuts a door. You can hear it in certain voices. People who have suffered deeply without becoming cruel usually speak more carefully, not because they are fragile, because they know exactly how much damage a sentence can do once it enters a lonely mind at the wrong hour. And suffering changes the way you see strangers, too. Before pain, people divide the world very simply. Good people, bad people, strong people, weak people. Then life breaks you privately, and suddenly everyone becomes more understandable. The man sitting alone in his car long after arriving home. The woman in the grocery store fighting tears over something too small to explain. The friend who disappeared during your hardest season because your grief forced them too close to their own. You begin noticing how many people are barely holding themselves together in public. And once you see that clearly, arrogance becomes difficult. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself because even emperors needed help surviving their own minds. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Not control, power. There is a difference. Control demands guarantees. Power is what remains after the guarantees disappear. Anyone can appear peaceful while life obeys them. The real test begins when reality stops negotiating, when the diagnosis comes, when the person leaves, when the phone rings at the wrong hour. Then the question becomes brutally simple. What now. Not philosophically, practically. How do you wake up tomorrow carrying what you now know about life? Some people answer by shrinking. They stop risking love, stop expecting honesty, stop believing people mean what they say, because expectation itself begins feeling dangerous. At first, this feels intelligent. Cynicism often does. It feels mature, observant, safe. But eventually, something terrible happens. Nothing reaches you anymore. Not pain, not joy either. And this is the tragedy of bitterness. It does not only reject suffering, it rejects life. The bitter person often believes they are protecting their heart, when in truth they are burying it alive. And still, even after terrible things, human beings remain strangely capable of wonder. This may be the most miraculous thing about us. A person can lose almost everything and still pause at a window because rain against glass suddenly sounds like forgiveness. Not complete forgiveness, just enough. Enough to breathe differently for 1 second. Enough to stay another day. And healing usually enters that quietly, not through revelation, through interruption. The first genuine laugh after months of pretending. Music hurting in a good way again. Someone asking if you are okay and waiting long enough to hear the real answer. Making tea at 2 a.m. and realizing the silence no longer feels hostile. Most healing arrives softly enough that people almost miss it. And often, the deepest people are simply the ones who learned not to close themselves completely after pain. This does not mean they trust blindly. A burned hand remembers fire. But memory does not have to become identity. You are not required to become the worst thing that happened to you. There are people whose personalities are made almost entirely from unresolved injury. Every conversation bends back toward resentment. Every disappointment becomes confirmation. Every new person inherits punishment meant for someone else years ago. And beneath that hardness, there is usually grief. Grief that stayed trapped too long and eventually fermented into anger, because anger feels more powerful than sorrow. Sometimes bitterness is just sadness that no longer believes anyone is coming close enough to understand it. That is why truly deep people are rarely quick to judge bitter people. They know how thin the line can become, how exhaustion changes perception, how betrayal alters the nervous system, how loneliness can make tenderness feel physically unsafe. That is where mercy becomes possible. Not the performance of it, the cost of it. Because once you understand how suffering rearranges a person, hatred becomes harder to maintain. You stop needing to win every argument. You stop worshiping invulnerability. You stop confusing numbness with strength. There is a kind of exhaustion that finally tells the truth. And the truth is that everyone breaks eventually. The real question is what happens afterward. Do you become unreachable, or do you become real? Because most real awakenings happen in ugly rooms, after funerals, inside failed relationships, during sleepless nights where the future suddenly looks much smaller than it used to. Awareness rarely arrives beautifully. Usually, it arrives when illusion can no longer survive reality. And maybe this is the quiet work of being human, to suffer without making suffering your identity, to grieve without building a permanent home inside grief, to remain reachable after life gives you every reason to disappear behind armor. There is immense courage in that, more than people realize, because bitterness is seductive. It simplifies the world. It tells you not to trust too deeply, not to hope too openly, not to need anybody too much. It calls this wisdom. Sometimes it even sounds like wisdom. But there are people who have suffered just as much and still answer the phone gently, still laugh easily, still believe honesty matters. Not because life spared them, because somewhere along the way they decided their pain would not become everybody else's weather. Maybe that decision has to be made repeatedly. Maybe nobody arrives there permanently. Maybe some mornings you wake up already losing the argument. But even then, there is a difference between carrying pain and handing it authority. Sometimes that difference is microscopic, catching yourself before bitterness speaks for you, answering softly when you wanted to wound, remaining honest when cynicism would feel easier. Sometimes it is that small. Sometimes it is everything. And maybe the strongest people are not the ones who avoid breaking. Maybe they are the ones who break and still refuse to become unrecognizable to themselves.